Now, we want to go back to an incredibly important development from August for the Philippines and Australia. Manila has been transforming the concept of security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific in the face of China's persistent threats to its territory. The Philippines has deftly woven around itself a web of deterrence through multi-layered troop arrangements, minilateral exercises and joint patrols. Chief among its non-US partners is Australia, and in August the two sides announced a different strand of that security lattice work. Watch.
Right now, Australia is pursuing 8 different infrastructure projects across 5 different locations here in the Philippines. And we've agreed now to establish a plan between our two countries which will guide the way in which our infrastructure investment is pursued over the coming years to see greater infrastructure here in the Philippines for the benefit of the armed forces of the Philippines.
There was a mention of infrastructure plans. Can you tell us
Pardon me?
Infrastructure plans?
We cannot tell you.
Okay.
What could those 8 projects be? Why the secrecy around them now? And could defence infrastructure cooperation become a new string to Manila's bow? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm ECDA. To discuss these stories and more, we're joined by Renato Cruz de Castro, National Zhengzhou University MOFA Taiwan Fellow and De La Salle University Department of International Studies Distinguished Professor. We also have Wen-Ti Song, Atlantic Council Global China Hub Non-Resident Fellow. A very warm welcome back to the show, Renato.
Good morning.
And Wen-Ti.
Thank you.
Manila and Canberra are to sign an enhanced defence cooperation agreement between their two countries in August next year. As part of this EDCA, Defence Secretary Guibo Titoro and his counterpart Richard Marles agreed on a defence infrastructure plan for the benefit of the Philippine Armed Forces. The Philippines signed an EDCA with the US in 2014 as part of the 1951 Mutual Defence Treaty. It allows the US to rotate its forces and pre-position equipment through 9 Philippine bases. Renato, let me come to you first. So firstly, why the secrecy over this? I mean, they know that there are across 5 sites, these 8 projects, and what could they be?
I think it's primarily aimed to support the Philippines as it transitions from internal security to external defense. This is a development that the Australians has always been looking for. The fact that you have security cooperation that has been there for some time, but it focused on low-key counterinsurgency internal security operation. Now, of course, ever since this current administration announced a comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, the Australians are very much saying, oh my goodness, now you are basically joining us in terms of strengthening your territorial defense capabilities. I think about 2 or 3 years ago, when you have an Australian P-8 Poseidon conducting a patrol over the South China Sea, then of course it was harassed by the Chinese. Then everybody discovered they came from Clark Air Base. This was not announced. Suddenly it became apparent that the Australians...
So do you think that some of these projects could be about, for example, lengthening, hardening runways for these very heavy Poseidon P-8 patrol planes, this kind of thing? So it's not just for the Philippine Armed Forces, although of course that the infrastructure is there. It's also, would it be to benefit the Australians, which have signed a VFA with
Of course, they want, of course, the projection here in terms of maritime and naval. But the third element here is something also very interesting. 2 or 3 years ago, I had the chance to be on board Her Majesty's Australian ship, Canberra, wherein, of course, the Australian Army basically conducted a massive military exercise. They brought their weapons, Apaches, Abram tanks, Bushmasters, they brought everything. So I think this might be related also in terms of developing the Philippine Army and the Royal Australian Army's territorial defense capabilities. So when they conduct military exercises, for example, right now they're doing something in the Visayas, but when they did it 3 years ago, it was really based on really repelling an invasion. A scenario wherein you have a foreign army landing on the beach somewhere in Luzon, and you have Filipino or Australian forces really conducting massive live fire exercise.
So it's to support these joint exercises between the Philippines and Australians. Yeah. Wen-Ti, Tedoro in that press conference said that the Australian EDCA would be different to the US's. EDCA, in what way do you think, and what would be the parameters?
Right, so I think U.S. and Australian security relation with Philippines, they are founded on different foundations. U.S. obviously has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, and what Australia has is a SVFA, which is Status of Visiting Forces Agreement. And I think judging from that, if you look at what the Filipino Defense Secretary said, when he talked about the Australian portion of the relationship, he emphasized the word joint a lot. He talked about how when Australians, if they work towards the deal, Australia will be able to, through that deal, increase both the frequency, intensity, and speed of joint activities, joint drills. So what it sounds to me is that the U.S. has a longer standing relation with the Philippines, and therefore perhaps are trusted with greater operational autonomy, whereas Australians know the boundary and know that whatever they do in or around Philippines will be done jointly with the Filipinos.
Right. And Renato, Manila requested, so this is under EDCA, the U.S. to keep its Typhoon missile and Nemesis missile systems in the Philippines after exercises. Could you see perhaps that this prepositioning of weapons might become a possibility under the Australian EDCA? And if so, what sort of message does this send to China?
I don't, looking at, of course, the inventory of the Australian self-defense force, I don't think they have strategic weapons like Typhoon or Nemesis. I'm thinking more in terms of in the future. Now, of course, you have AUKUS, where Australia will, of course, be acquiring 9 nuclear-powered attack submarines that could be used in contingency here in the South China Sea and, of course, in Taiwan. That's where I'm thinking in terms of probably enhanced defense cooperation site, a joint site with Australia would really matter. In terms probably of developing submarine pens so Australia could operate those nuclear attack submarines that Australia is planning to get under AUKUS. This is just sort of my speculation. Because at this point in time, the Australian Defense Force simply doesn't have any strategic weapons comparable to what the Americans have.
Right, right. Renato mentioned AUKUS, which is the nuclear-powered submarines from the US, and also they developed their own with the UK. Some Australians think this is a waste of money for Australia, that they think it's exorbitant price, and also some believe that the Albanese government isn't spending enough on Australia's own defence. So do you believe that there might be pushback to this kind of arrangement with the Philippines where Australia defence forces are basically investing in Philippine infrastructure?
I think Australian, obviously there's always going to be a trade-off between, bullet versus butter, or defense spending versus domestic welfare spending. But I think Australians do have a tradition of forward presence. We know that Australians, yes, it's very far away from much of the Northern Hemisphere, but we also know that Australians, they fought in World War I in Turkey, for example, in European theater. And they fought again in Burma and elsewhere during World War II. So I think Australians, strategic thinkers know that for Australia, they need to make sure that they are engaged, that they are out there, that they are able to foster deterrence and potentially dissuade conflict from happening in the first place, rather than taking too much of a relaxing attitude and wait until things get closer to your neighborhood. And I think on that score, quite a number of incidents, not only across South China Sea, but also closer to Australia in recent months, has been quite an important wake-up call for Australia.
Which we'll go into. Renato, not all Filipinos are happy with the US presence and plans, and especially the weapons. Do you expect any pushback against the Australians over the next few years?
Well, again, going back to my point, Australians do not have these big toys, like, the Typhoon or Nemesis. So I don't think it will generate that degree of, anti-Australian sentiment. Although, in case of the Americans, you have this sort of, but again, based on the recent surveys conducted by Pulse Asia and of course Social Weather Station, Filipinos in general, first and foremost, they don't trust China, and they basically see the importance of alliances and security partnerships. Definitely there'll be one that will be criticizing, but again, they would probably focus on the Americans who are bringing in these big strategic weapons in contrast to the Australians, which are, of course, doing it in a very low-key manner.
Right, and I believe in that those same Pulse surveys, actually trust in Australia is very high.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, now in February this year, a Chinese naval task group conducted a full circumnavigation of Australia. We're showing the map here. And as part of that, launched live fire exercises with no warning, an enormous show of force intended to intimidate Australia and New Zealand and send a signal to the region. This was a recording obtained just last month by Australia's Channel 9 of the moment a pilot flying overhead was made aware.
We've just had a warning from a Chinese naval task force that they're doing a live firing exercise. Is anyone aware of that?
So they advise the level that they'll be firing to?
Negative, just within a 10 mile radius of that position. That was it.
So, Wendy, what did you make of that, the audio of the pilot flying overhead? Obviously, neither of them knew anything about this, which is incredibly worrying.
Yeah, I mean, that incident, of course, has been quite a wake-up call for Australian public, for sure. I mean, for the longest time, China was often seen as primarily economic opportunity that Australian could benefit from, but we know in recent years there have been new turbulences in that situation, in the relationship, and that incident recently is one final wake-up call. I think henceforth it's becoming ever more acceptable now in Australian circles that China is not only economic opportunity, but at least just as much a security risk factor that Australia need to proactively seek to manage.
Yeah, and because this particular government, the Albanese government, it has been criticised for being soft on China, whereas the Scott Morrison government beforehand was not. So you talked about this as being a wake-up call. What sort of difference did you detect in the government, the rhetoric, the words on this, after this incident happened February, March this year?
I would say that what rhetoric aside, I think there is, generally speaking, a broader concurrence of broader strategic thinking when it comes to China across administration, at least in recent years. What I mean by that is that Australia clearly signed on to AUKUS, and at the time of signing back in 2021, of course, that's about 4 years ago, they call it a generational partnership that is between US, UK, and Australia, and that's something that Australian defense establishment and foreign policy thinkers are committing themselves to, for sure, and I see that consistent as well under the current administration. Now, I think for Albanese, there are times, the current Prime Minister of Australia, there are times when he feels like he needs to balance perception a little bit, because initially across much of Asia-Pacific, AUKUS was seen as somewhat of a revival of a more Western, Euro-Atlantic, Austro-Asian military arrangement that perhaps chips away slightly at Australians' previous mantra of Australia finding security in Asia rather than finding security from Asia. So you see Albanese trying to do some more diplomatic PR work, if you will, to engage Southeast Asia a lot more, and to also including more recently taking a trip to China, for example, where Albanese was standing on the Great Wall, taking a nice photo op, and to show to, I think, Chinese side, it's a bit of a charm offensive on that side.
Okay. Now, Renato, let's look at Australia's motives. Wendy talked about, it's important for their forward posture on the Philippines in the South China Sea. It's not, is it, that Australia is worried that China will invade or attempt to take any of its territory, unlike the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and of course Taiwan. So what are those motives? Let's define them.
Yeah, number one, of course, is the importance of forward deployment, something that the Australians learned during the Second World War.
But why?
Especially after the fall of Singapore.
Okay. And
of course, they were abandoned by the British. Eventually, the Americans came in. So there's a thinking that we have to basically, to defend the homeland, we have to ensure that we have, of course, a strategic advantage in the region. In a way, there's a balance of power, that there's no dominant power dominates the East Asia or the Indo-Pacific region, because in the long run, it would threaten Australia's interests.
So this is for crisis. They are preparing. This is all for war.
Not necessarily. I think it's more of the fact that this has been their strategic outlook, a forward-looking strategic outlook based on the realization that there should be a balance of power in the region, given the fact that Australia is practically alone. It's far from Europe, it's near Asia, but not part of Asia, it's Indo-Pacific. So in fact, the term Indo-Pacific has been emphasized by the Australian. The first time I heard the term Indo-Pacific was from my Australian classmates when I was taking a course in Hawaii in the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. And I kind of find it Indo-Pacific, now it's being used. And I heard it first from the Australians.
Not the Japanese.
Probably because you're Japanese. Of course, the element there of Australia's idea of forward deployment, plus, of course, something that the Australians also value, their alliance with the United States.
Right.
Yeah.
And
if I may
Wendy,
chime in
yeah, sure, jump
on
in.
that as well. Yeah, I definitely agree with Renato 100% there. Yeah, I mean, for Australia, it benefits Australian security to have a certain power equilibrium in the large region. That is Asia-Pacific, or if you will, Indo-Pacific. And one other thing, again, is also on U.S. alliance. In Australian diplomatic circle, there's a line we often refer to, and that is 100 years of mateship. And that is, Australia has 100 years of strategic friendship with the U.S. side. That every single overseas conflict that U.S. has been involved in, ever since a century ago, Australia is always there.
Right. Okay. And there's also, of course, the trade. You know, the sea lines of communication. There's that issue as well. Renato, do you think that this particular instance, or how much did it contribute to Australia moving much closer to the Philippines?
Well, of course, now you have, of course, the sort of a backlash.
Yeah.
No, we won't now allow the Chinese to intimidate us right in our maritime backyard.
Do you think that was a major fault, a major a mistake by the Chinese to do that to the Australians and New Zealanders?
They've always been doing it against us, against the Japanese, against the Americans, thinking of the fact that they could intimidate country by showing basically their flag, their naval vessels. So I think in the case of Australia and New Zealand, it backfired. We just signed, of course, a status of force agreement with New Zealand. Far away New Zealand, very much interested in signing a status of force agreement with the Philippines.
Okay. Now, we're showing the latest act of aggression by China against the Philippines in the South China or West Philippine Sea near Tito Island. A Chinese Coast Guard ship, water cannons, and then rams a much smaller Philippine vessel, which is part of the resupply of fishermen in the area. And then I want to highlight this testimonial of Eli Ratner, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific in the Biden administration, to a recent Senate hearing on China's behavior in the Indo-Pacific. Watch.
One thing I think we have to remember as we think about this issue set is when we see the PRC doing something out at Second Thomas Shoal or out at Scarborough Shoal, those very specific tactical features and locations are important, but they're part of a bigger story, which is China's ambitions to control the South China Sea, to control the East Asian littoral. What we need to be doing in response and in parallel to China's ICAD activities is not just playing whack-a-mole, though we should be out there defending their tactical moves, but rather thinking about what are the strategic actions we need to be taking to ensure that they can't, in the end, have that kind of effective control that they want. So with the Philippines, for instance, yes, we need to be supporting them out at Scarborough Shoal, but we ought to be working on our force posture in the Philippines. We ought to be expanding the number of locations we're investing in. We ought to be investing a lot more in those locations to develop them. We should be bringing more advanced capabilities into those locations. We should be operating more and more with our allies and partners, the Australians and the Japanese, who both have reciprocal access agreements.
Wanty, so we heard there Eli Ratner. Just to explain, ICAD is illegal, coercive, aggressive, deceptive behavior, and this is a new term which they want to use to replace grey zone warfare, which frankly seems too soft and not specific enough in terms of China's tactics. So I want to ask you what we just heard there, this strategy of how to counter China. So the more long-term, as Eli Ratner was saying there, strategy. Do you see that the Philippines is actually doing that itself by reaching out to its partners? So again, the question is, how much is the Philippines actually taking upon itself to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think Philippines has been proactive. It's very keenly aware that it's right there on the front line in terms of engagement with China or potentially gray zone ICAD, as we call it. And so we see Philippines becoming ever more engaged with Quad Plus, for example. Philippines can play a role in that. That kind of thing is
still U.S. Involvement. So I guess what I'm getting at is how much is the Philippines actually exercising its own agency when it isn't part of perhaps a U.S.-led, say Quad or U.S.-involved grouping. How much is it that the Philippines is itself becoming this nexus?
We are seeing, of course, Philippines having more U.S. access to Filipino bases, as well as greater invitation of Australia and other countries in terms of strengthening engagement there. So I think clearly Philippines is aware that it's right there on the first island chain, is right next door to Taiwan. There can be no Taiwan contingency that doesn't affect the Philippines.
Right. And Renato, what did you make of Eli Ratner's, this was just very recent, this testimonial? It seems to lay out exactly the strategy that the Philippines has been undertaking.
He mentioned the fact that you have a number of components of that strategy. There's simply no what they call a silver bullet, because it'll be a long-term game. So what is basically this, the measures he basically told us is that we should never pull back. We should never show China that we're intimidated by what you're doing. Whatever action you take, of course, you'll have, of course, a counter reaction. And this, of course, is also happening in case of how they try to intimidate Australia. So this should be the measure that we have to show China. You cannot push us back. We will, of course, react in our, in measures short of actual use of force.
And also, I want to pick up and get your analysis on this idea of effective control. So we see that, whilst the Philippines and the US and allies have been rallying around the Philippines. However, China's activities, its ICAD, have continued.
Well, what the Philippines, Australia, Canada, France have been doing is, of course, especially in the maritime domain. So China would try to basically effect, for example, in Scarborough Shoal, effective control, which is, of course, easier said than done given the distance from Hainan to Chinese coast. So what the Philippines and its partners and allies are doing are conducting what we call maritime cooperative activity. So the Philippine Navy spokesperson, Admiral Roy Trinidad, said, every time we conduct this maritime cooperative activity, the Chinese backs off. So in a way, no one has an effective control of this maritime domain. It remains contested. And this will be really a case of a test of will. So once, of course, the Australians would come in, just in case, of course, they would have their own joint site, not an Australian base, so they could operate. They don't have to be, of course, burdened by the tyranny of distance. So probably this is one of the projects of, behind that Enhanced Defense Cooperation Program between the Philippines and Australia would be probably a port facility that the Royal Australian Navy could utilize, along possibly with the Japanese. Now we have, of course, the reciprocal access agreement. So what's basically the Philippines is doing is in making sure that it's not just in terms of creating this network. The Philippines became, of course, a base of operation for countries who have interest in maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific.
And Munti, just finally, there is the bilateral consultative mechanism between the Philippines and China. There's one being discussed right now where the result could be an MOU between China and the Philippines. Do you think that this could be effective, like the one at Second Thomas Shoal?
Yeah, I mean, whether such MOU result obviously remains to be seen, but I think the question is that even if you do have an MOU, how meaningful is it and how long-term lasting is it? I mean, too often, China, when it comes to China's management of South China Sea, they like to use the very act of dialogue itself as if it's a concession already.
And how do the other side, how does the Philippines, the US, how do they view dialogue, if you just define the stark differences in approach?
Yeah, I think dialogue for Western countries or for many other countries in the international community, it's meant to be part of your daily routine, which talking things out is much preferable to using force, to doing ICAD or any gray zone. But China sees dialogue as something different, and indeed they often weaponize it for so many diplomatic settings. Every time there's a tense relationship between China and Southeast Asian countries, for example, you will see China say, oops, sorry about that, let me engage in talk with you again. And so I remember that's back in 2002, roughly, when they signed the Declaration of Conduct in the South China Sea. Ever since then, every time there's problem between China's relationship with Southeast Asia, China then said, hey, I'm happy to talk to you about moving towards a code of conduct, not just a declaration of conduct on South China Sea. And to this day, that's still a talking point, and I don't see that really yielding concrete results. So again, MOU could be interesting, but whether it means anything really depends.
Could not be worth the paper it's written on. Renato, just to wrap up the theme, so to what extent do you think that this infrastructure development or defense infrastructure development by partners of Manila could become a new layer, as we said, or strand of this web deterrence? We already listed, the visiting forces agreements, the multi-cooperative activities, which are the patrols, and then of course there are the multilateral or minilateral exercises. So defense infrastructure investment.
Well, I'll focus in on the Australian proposal. Well, again, in contrast to the American offer of EDCA, we know for a fact that the Americans would rather operate on their own because it's the only superpower in the world that has a military capability. In the case of Australia, this is how the Philippines and Australia view it. We're both middle powers. So it's very essential that we would have to cooperate. Whatever the Australians would put on the table will be primarily aimed for cooperation between two middle powers, the Philippines and, of course, Australia. So that's the case. When we look at the Australian effort to strengthen its security partnership with the Philippines, it's primarily aimed for cooperation between two middle powers and, in ensuring that we have a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Renato Cruz de Castro and Wonti Song, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.